first of all, I'm going to introduce Akemi, because Akemi is going to be moderating this session. Akemi, wave to us so that everybody knows which
Hello,
one.
everyone.
Okay. So, Dr. Akemi Luisa Herraiz-Fosbrink is a cultural heritage researcher at the Online University UNIR in Madrid. She specializes in Spanish Golden Age and Viceregal Latin American art. She previously worked as a researcher at the Nicolás Cortés Gallery in Madrid. And she was also a curatorial fellow and intern at multiple museums, such as the Wallace Collection, the National Gallery, the Meadows Museum in Dallas, and the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles. Her doctoral thesis at the University of Cambridge focused on the Spanish 17th century artist Francisco de Zurbarán and his reception in the Americas. So, Akemi, I'm handing over to you. Vivian says a very quick intro would be great.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for the kind introduction. And I really enjoyed the first sessions of papers, and I very much look forward to hearing the second session. And yes, without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Vivian Kogut-Lessa Dessa. She is an associate professor in Portuguese studies at Cambridge University. Her publications focus on 16th century cultural exchanges between England, Portugal, and Brazil, with a special interest in indigenous Brazilians, Jesuit missionary work, and European Atlantic travel. Her 2015 book, The Admirable Adventures and Strange Fortunes of Anthony Knivet, is the first critical edition of one of the earliest accounts of Brazil. In 2020, she published with Sheila Hugh, Ingleses no Brasil, Relatos de Viagem, 1526-1608, a collection of 12 little-known English travel accounts of colonial Brazil. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Akemi. Nice to meet you. And
very nice to meet you.
Thanks, everyone, for being here and there. And thanks, Nicola, for organizing this fascinating symposium. I feel a little bit like an interloper because I'm not an art historian. I'm sharing with you today a part of a more recent research I have embarked on. This research is an attempt to understand how Brazilian indigenous artifacts challenged European epistemologies in the 16th century. My aim is to investigate how these objects taken, bartered, smuggled, or bought, how these objects were made to fit different frameworks of understanding and how they ended up serving as conduits for European desire and fear. I like to engage with a field that is the cultural biography of objects. Understanding objects as carrying multi-layered meanings. In this sense, artifacts from the past can also be seen as a kind of semantic magnet. They gather different meanings as they travel across time and space and pass through different hands and under different eyes. And of course, I think I will be, in a way, dialoguing with some of the papers given here before. In this paper, I examine how early European visual representations of Brazilian indigenous objects can offer us a window not so much into indigenous culture, but rather into the early modern European anxieties and fantasies about the New World and its inhabitants. This discussion about objects transiting between cultures, as so much has been said already, casts long shadows. As my fellow Brazilians present here today, here and there, will know, and maybe non-Brazilians too, there has recently been widespread media coverage, both in Brazil and abroad, around a Tupinambá feather mantle that the National Museum of Denmark has recently returned to Brazil after nearly 400 years. And here you can see the mantle that was returned to the Museu Nacional in Rio, and an early depiction of the same, a similar mantle being worn actually by Europeans in a kind of fancy dress procession. This Tupinambá mantle, which was returned recently, is one of around 11 other mantles currently held in European collections, despite relentless campaigning for their return by descendants of the early Tupinambá still living in Brazil. At the heart of the dispute is the immense value ascribed to the mantle by two very different mindsets. For museums, the mantle holds priceless historical and archaeological value. For the Tupinambá descendants, the mantle is both a long-lost ancestor and a repository of that which is most sacred for them. And it's interesting because we were talking about feathers and the immense value ascribed to feathers since the very early contacts. So the Tupinambá, whose traditional artwork has been at the center of these recent disputes, are a branch of a much larger group inhabiting the coast of Brazil at the time of the first contacts with the Portuguese. So the Portuguese officially took possession of Brazil in 1500, for those who do not know. And when they first arrived, the coast was largely inhabited by groups of people who mostly spoke varieties of one language, which is referred to as Tupi-Guarani, or more generally Tupi. As you can see, all the groups in yellow. So this predominant group was subdivided in myriad different tribes, often at war with one another, but which shared common linguistic and cultural traits. Since these Tupi groups were the first to come in touch with European travelers, they also bore the early brunt of systematic colonial violence and disease. And for the same reason, the earliest indigenous artifacts brought to Europe from Brazil would have been produced by Tupi-speaking peoples. So my paper focuses not on the Tupinambá feather mantle, which is the star of the news, but rather on another object, another Tupi object, the Ibirapema. So some of you might have seen it. Here we have a specimen currently held in Paris. And on the right-hand side, we have an early print of an indigenous man holding an Ibirapema. And this, of course, is part of Jean de Lery's famous account of his voyage to Brazil in the late 16th century. So the Ibirapema was a ceremonial wooden club made of very hard wood. And at the time of the first contacts with the Europeans, it was used by Tupinambá groups which practiced traditional sacrificial rituals. A tool or weapon, as well as an artifact, the Ibirapema was painstakingly prepared and decorated prior to being used to ritually execute the prisoner. And this execution, of course, was through smashing his skull. By the way, just a parenthesis, I realized some of the papers given earlier were touched on several religious elements. In my paper, by contrast, is all about violence, sex, and nakedness. So, yay! I love this. This is to wake people up after the tea break. Anyway, so the Ibirapema was used in the sacrificial rituals. And after it was used, of course, the dead prisoner would then be roasted and consumed, cannibalized. But unlike the feather mantle with its striking decorative elements, the Ibirapema was soon adopted in Europe as an emblem of indigenous savagery. What I'd like to bring today to you is the surprising fact that it would also feature in these early European textual and visual representations of America, as linked to indigenous femininity, and hence as a gendered marker of otherness. And the sharp listener will notice that the print that I've included here features a man holding the Ibirapema, which might contradict my point. But as I hope to show you, apart from Léry's visual representation and others, we also have a whole host of iconography, which puts the Ibirapema firmly in the realm of indigenous femininity. So the Ibirapema first appeared in Europe via Americo Vespucci's letters describing his travels to South America aboard a Portuguese fleet. These travels would have happened between 1501 and 1502. I'm not going to go into the reliability of Vespucci's accounts or even the authorship, which was contested, and there was a huge polemic. But instead, I want to mention that, of course, his letters started being published from 1504 onwards, and as we all know, became an instant success. The letters, of course, would not only give Vespucci enormous notoriety, linking his name thereafter with the New World, but also sedimented a specific view of the inhabitants of this New World. This view exaggerated what was perceived as their most exotic traits, their nakedness, their lack. Actually, I have here a copy of one of Vespucci's editions. So their nakedness, their lack of discernible social hierarchy, and their cannibalistic practices, which take a prominent role in his letters. If anyone is familiar with the letters, this, of course, was largely responsible for bringing all this notoriety, this sensational description of the indigenous people of the New World. Of course, all of this, in turn, provided the basis for stereotypes that would last throughout the century and beyond. I want to turn our attention to an episode that Vespucci narrates in his second letter. He describes a moment when the Portuguese fleet has anchored off the coast of Brazil, perhaps on the northeast side of Brazil. It's not very clear, of course. This is the very early days of a European presence, so this coast hasn't been actually charted. But Vespucci describes to us that the Portuguese had been there for a few days and that interactions with the local tribe were very tense, that there was a kind of impasse until, as he tells us, one day, a group of women came down to the beach and began to coax the Portuguese ashore. After much deliberation, the Portuguese decided to send, and I quote, a very agile and valiant youth to meet them, to meet this group of indigenous women. As soon as this man steps onto the shore, he is surrounded by the women who, according to Vespucci, and I quote, began to touch and feel him, wondering at him exceedingly. I told you. Distracted, of course, the poor man then failed to see that, and I quote again, a woman came from the hill carrying a great stick in her hand. When she came to where our Christian stood, she raised it and gave him such a blow that he was felled to the ground. The other women immediately took him by the feet and dragged him towards the hill. End of quote. The rest of the story is, people are regretting that they had a sandwich now. The rest of the story is nothing short of harrowing as the Portuguese watched in horror, and I quote again, they all ran away towards the hill where the women were still tearing the Christian to pieces. At a great fire they had made, they roasted him before our eyes. showing us many pieces and then eating them. End of quote. Sorry about this. In the story, the indigenous women are depicted equally as lascivious and bloodthirsty, wielding the great stick, just like the Ibirapema would have been used to execute captives before the cannibal feast, smashing their heads. What is surprising, though, is that according to all the ethnographic information that we have, the ritual execution of prisoners was always the prerogative of men. Why did Vespucci place the Ibirapema in the hands of a woman? I'm not going to answer this. Maybe we can discuss afterwards. What is important for us to know is that by 1550, his letters had run to 40 editions and been translated into all the main European languages. One result was that cartographic representations of America began to locate the site of cannibalism firmly in Brazil, as we can see in Sebastian Münster's map of 1544. And I want to draw your attention to, oh, well, I cannot. But if you see where Brazil should have been, there is this open fire with limbs. Oh, thank you. With severed limbs, a severed head, and of course the word cannibale. Another result was that it triggered a tradition of prints around New World cannibalism. In 1505, the first illustrated edition of Vespucci's letters featured a telling image that some of you might be familiar with, a woodcut. In this woodcut, we can see a group munching on body parts on the left, which are roasting over an open fire, and a group of indigenous warriors, half covered in feathers and holding their weapons. But crucially, sandwiched between the two groups, an indigenous woman tenderly nurses her child while looking after two other young children. And of course, the Portuguese ships are in the background. This juxtaposition of motherhood and cannibalism served not only to make the image particularly unsettling, it also established a specific trope in European imagination regarding female indigeneity. If early accounts and images underscored indigenous nakedness and promiscuity, now indigenous women were being represented as bloodthirsty mothers. Other publications reused this image, as this one from 1520 from a pamphlet published in Antwerp purporting to describe the new lands and the people found by the messengers of the King of Portugal. And here you can see that some images featuring in the earlier woodcut are reused and perhaps exaggerated because the cannibalistic scene shows the severed head over the open fire with blood dripping from it. We have one of the warriors holding a large stick. We don't know exactly if it would have been an Ibirapema, but we have the mother, the indigenous mother, nursing her child. So it's almost like a metonymic representation of the earlier woodcuts, trying to emphasize what is really relevant to be emphasized. Motherhood and cannibalism would reappear in Johannes Stradano's iconic 1580s engraving, again, an image that I think some of you will be familiar with. This print is part of a series made by Stradanos to celebrate great European feats and inventions. And there's a whole part about great European men, and Vespucci appears here in full regalia. He stands dressed, holding on one hand the banner of Christ, on another hand the astrolabe, so symbols of European civilization. Behind him, the Portuguese carvel. And of course, he's in the act of awakening an indigenous woman from her slumber of ignorance. and that's America, the title of the print itself. Reclining on a hammock and exposing her voluptuous naked body, America is surrounded by various exotic animals, with an Ibirapema strategically resting next to her against the trunk of a tree. Can everyone see it? So the stark cultural clash represented by these two characters risks, however, overshadowing what happens in the background. And I appreciate it's very small. I don't know how to, is there a way of zooming in? Yeah, but it would be wonderful if we could zoom in, because there's such a richness of detail, but it's okay. I don't want to risk. Everything can go wrong. What happens exactly halfway between Vespucci and America is no less significant. A group sits around an open fire where human limbs are being roasted. But one of these people has their back to us, and it's a woman sitting with her back to us, holding a baby in her arms. That's what I really wanted to show you, which cannot be seen from far. Seemingly just in the act of breastfeeding or about to breastfeed. The Ibirapema's direct connection to the sacrificial ritual would make it the prime symbol of indigenous violent savagery. Its presence in iconography served to signal an association between cannibalism and femininity in the New World. An account published by the German Hans Staden in 1567, again, many people here might be familiar with this, both dispelled and reinforced some of these tropes. Staden had been captured by a tribe of Tupinambá in 1552 while working as a mercenary gunner for the Portuguese near present-day São Paulo on the coast. He spent 9 months in captivity with this tribe, and during this time, he was repeatedly threatened with ritual execution and consumption. And he experienced firsthand every aspect of tribal life. After managing to return to Europe, he published what is possibly the only detailed account of Tupinambá sacrificial rituals given by someone who was himself also a potential victim of sacrifice. And of course, and this is what we have on the left, is the cover of his work entitled Wahrhaftige Historia, translated in English as the true story and description of a country of wild, naked, grim, man-eating people in the New World, America. That's where I come from, by the way. Anyway, Staden's book provides a wealth of ethnographic detail and includes several woodcuts, as you can see on the right-hand side, and even on the cover. Some of these woodcuts were believed to have been drawn by Staden himself. And of course, they gave ethnographic validity to the book. But some of them, as the one on the right-hand side, depict what Staden calls the Iwerapeme, the club which they used to kill their captives. He also details how the Ibirapema was carefully prepared by the tribe's women ahead of the sacrificial ceremonies in specific rituals, which involved dancing and chanting and meticulously gluing eggshells, broken eggshells, to decorate the club. In his description, it becomes clear that while the women were in charge of decorating and adorning the Ibirapema, it was the men who put it to use. So the executioner was always male. Though Staden's work was to gain enormous currency among European readers and establish lasting tropes about the New World and its inhabitants, it was allegorical depictions of the new continent which circulated in Europe that would sediment the Ibirapema as an emblem of intimidating femininity. An example is Abraham Ortelius's groundbreaking atlas of 1570. So at the time, a world atlas was still something new, and Ortelius publishes this book, which was meant to help people travel around the world simply by leafing through a book. And of course, it's aptly, the frontispiece aptly shows us a portal. Supposedly, if you cross this portal, you enter the world and you can cross it. But importantly also is the fact that this portal is adorned by the 5 known continents, allegorized as women. This of course, was not new. But I want to draw your attention to the depiction of these different women. Of course, Europe reigning supreme on top, sitting crowned with a scepter, followed below by Asia and Africa. But tellingly, America is at the lowest level of all. Her savage and untamed physicality is on full display. She appears at the lowest level in contrast to the other 3 allegorical figures and sits on the floor, fully naked, a bow and arrows resting under her leg, her left arm outstretched, clutching a severed head, and the other holding a decorated Ibirapema. This image seems to conflate European perceptions of American and Brazilian indigeneity. So while America's exposed breasts and genitalia may seem seductive, her arms and legs display her bloodthirstiness. Presented this way, America is both irresistible and dangerously untamed. And I want to finish by considering the fate of the Ibirapema. So what happened to the Ibirapema now, centuries after cannibalistic practices have disappeared? Has it become a museum item alone? There's no use to it nowadays, or is there? What new meanings have been ascribed to it? And of course, if you go online and you do a quick search for Ibirapema on Google, you will find there's a thriving online market for Ibirapemas as a decorative object. But also I wanted to finish by showing you, and I don't know how we're going to do this, that the Ibirapema has made a return in indigenous arts nowadays in Brazil. So there has been in the recent decades of growing attention on that's it. That's the image. Thank you so much. So attention to indigenous art, which is a very politicized kind of art. And of course, I found this image, which has now disappeared.
One moment.
Stop sharing.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
No,
Anyway,
Yes, I can see it. Yes.
This is just one example of the work by this artist, Herbert de Paz, which I found. I could only include the link because of copyrights. But I thought it was quite interesting. You might not remember my opening slide. I'm not going to go back, which features a very early map of Brazil. And on this map, you can see images of indigenous people cutting wood, carrying wood. So what Herbert de Paz does is he takes some of those images, he recreates them here, but he also adds an indigenous man in the process of using the Ibirapema against none other than Christopher Columbus. Anyway, I'll just stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that wonderful talk. I will now pass on to Dr. Claudia de Oliveira. Claudia is Associate Professor of History of Art at the School of Fine Arts, Federal University of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. She holds a PhD in Social History at UFRJ and University of Bristol, and an MA in Cultural History and a BA in History. Claudia's research concentrates on the field of feminist art history and the study of Brazilian women artists forgotten by the canon of Brazilian art history.
Good afternoon. I want to greet my colleagues and thank the organizers of this symposium and say that it's a pleasure to be here in an event who looks at the history of art in the global south. I'm going to pass and read my paper in order to keep on time. In fact, I'm going to talk about a canvas which was in fact founded quite early, I mean, at the beginning of this century. Well, market scene, can you see it? Well, I don't know if you can see the
Yes.
informations. Okay.
Yes.
So, market scene is a title attributed a posteriori to the composition Fruits from Nature by Brazilian painter Francisca Manuela Valadão, which was exhibited at the General Exhibition of the Imperial Academy of Fine Arts in Rio de Janeiro in 1864. The artist was born in Rio de Janeiro in 1830 and died in 1898. To analyze the painter's point of view and skill in executing the style and theme addressed, I will refer to the composition by its original title, Fruits from Nature. The composition Oops, sorry. Just a sec. The composition was the first painting to show a scene featuring slavery in an oil painting in Brazil in the 19th century. The fact that the canvas was created by a Brazilian artist who was herself an owner of captives is most surprising and raises the question, why does she highlight the black slave on the left returned to her? The scene was indeed innovative and also very provocative for a Brazilian audience at that time. Through the exchange of views between black slave and white artist, the painter gives visibility to the slave, and by doing so, she places him as a subject, a black subject who dares to look into the eyes of a white lady. From this perspective, we believe that Francisca Manuela Valadão, a female painter, appears to stand out from her peers since she dared to introduce a representation of the enslaved population into an academy art saloon. As a result, the artist seems to have created an uncomfortable situation for the white gaze of her time, and maybe for that reason, Fruits from Nature did not receive any reviews from the critics of her time, nor afterwards did Francisca Valadão present another painting in an annual exhibition ever again. In fact, the artist and her canvas only came to light in 2016 in a major exhibition organized by the Museum of Art of São Paulo, entitled A Women's History. The canvas allows contemporary art histories to investigate artists and their works following a renewed art history capable of rethinking art objects as started by the French art historian Ané Lafont when analyzing the painting Portrait des Négresses by the French female painter Marie-Guillemine Benoit, shown at the Louvre in 18,000. Fruits from natural, fruits from natural show us that the artists most likely had access to different matrices of artistic representations, such as the market scenes from the classical European painting tradition, the iconography of slavery scenes made by European artists traveling in Brazil in the 19th century, as well as her own desire to create a naturalistic representation. From the point of view of the classical painting tradition in Europe, fruits from nature combines still life with the genre painting. The first paintings in this style we can see in the slides date from the 16th and 17th century by the Dutch artist Pieter Aertsen and his nephew, student Joachim Belklauer, who created a genre that broke the spatial planes of the canvas, distributing his objects in the form of montage to give the impression of abundance. In these paintings, the artists give prominence to the female peasant market seller, placing her surrounded by fruits, vegetables, birds, and animals for sale. The genre was developed by Dutch artists like Ian van Kessel, the elder, and Frans Hals, and also by the female French painter Louise Moulin in the 7th century. In all of these paintings, we see skilled and original achievements by the artists who conceive a new composition technique, but above all, create visual records made outside the studio in quick sketches, a technique known as from nature. In the market scene created by Francisca Valadão, the position of subjects and objects are reversed. She allocates the foreground to the tropical fruits and exotic animals, perhaps to highlight the diversity of Brazilian nature. And in the background, she portrays a record of captive life, showing 4 Black women, grocery sellers, and a Black man, all either slaves or freed slaves, and on the far right, a white woman as a buyer. These 5 Black characters were escravos de ganho, or captives for hire, or earning slaves, and people who had to provide services for third parties, being forced to hand over an agreed amount of money as stipulated by their owners at the end of the day, and keeping only a small part of their earnings for themselves. In general, such captives lived in urban areas where they were more likely to be able to save money to buy their freedom. Women, for example, sold delicacies and vegetables, and men were shoemakers, barbers, porters, and so on. In the women we see in this composition then were the quitandeiras, who would be seen on the streets of the main cities in stalls or carrying trays, selling fruits, vegetables, fish, eggs, seasonings, and also ready-made food such as cake, biscuits, and juices. As we can see, Fruits from Nature presents a market scene in a cultural landscape of 19th century Rio de Janeiro, when the city was an essential part of the Black Atlantic. Francisca Valadão innovated in the traditional iconography of the market scene by documenting a record of captivity as a form of exploitation of slave labor in modern times. Thus, the artist moves away from the ideal image of the Black captive population in their everyday life, such as those created by white European male artists, who transformed them into cliches of exotic population. By including non-white bodies in the image, the painter focused on the two Black models on the left. Just a sec. Oh, sorry. On the left, and on the left of the image. The Black women do not confront the painter's gaze and seems to simulate a diversion of attention to the action in progress. And the Black man faces the painter in an extremely significant expression, since his gaze alludes your absolute lack of power over his body, his person, and its representation. Francisca organizes the composition in several planes, emphasizing chromaticism, which is intense, and direct the viewer's gaze to the profusion of warm colors in shades of red, yellow, and orange, sprinkled with cold and refreshed greenish tones. The brush strokes creates a vivid appearance to highlight the shine of fruits, vegetables, and animals. We also note that the painter applied this profusion of warm colors on a predominantly brown base, which highlights the objects in representation. The painter's skill in the use of colors allow us to see that the artist used the chromaticism, the chromatic profusion, to also create a sensation of distance between foreground and background, where the Black figures are arranged. The warmer and the bright colors in the foreground became paler on our gaze as our gaze approaches to the background where the Black slaves and white women are located. Thus, we see that through the intense use of colors, the artist skillfully draws the viewer's attention to the richness and diversity of tropical nature, but also shows that this richness was only possible through the work of a population that, by virtue of color and the extreme metaphors of enslavement, find themselves in the confines of otherness. By conclusion, looking at fruits from nature today, we cannot affirm that the painter's interest was representing the slave labor in Brazil at her time, but in fact, she ended up highlighting the tense and paradoxical relationship between Blacks and white, establishing other interpretative links. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudia. It was a fascinating presentation. So now I would like to introduce Montserrat Baez Hernandez. She is currently studying for a doctorate in history at the Universidad de Teramo in KU Leuven. She received an MA in art history from the National Autonomous University of Mexico and a BA in history from Benemérita Universidad Autónoma de Puebla. She has authored several texts on the patrimony of the city of Puebla, Mexico, and has more than 10 years experience as a curator for institutions including INA, the Museo Sumaya, Museos Puebla, and the BUAP. She is the author of El cuerpo prodigioso de Sebastián de Aparicio en la Puebla de Los Ángeles. Thank you very much.
First and foremost, I would like to thank to the organizing committee for accepting my proposal. And I'm very honored to share my presentation with all of these amazing researchers. I'm sorry, I'm going to present in Spanish because currently I'm still working on this research. So my excuses, but I will be able to answer your questions in English. Sebastián de Aparicio nació en la villa de Gudiña, Galicia, España, entre 1510 y 1514. En su juventud se embarcó a la Nueva España desde Sanlúcar de Barrameda y a su llegada se desempeñó como agricultor. Se le atribuye la introducción a la Nueva España de la carreta de tracción animal y apertura de vías en el camino real de tierra adentro. En su vida secular logró reunir una gran fortuna en tierras de labor. Sin embargo, en su edad madura donó sus posesiones a las monjas de Santa Clara y en 1575 profesó en la orden franciscana en el convento de San Francisco el Grande de la Ciudad de México. Tras una breve estancia en dicho convento, fue trasladado a otros establecimientos franciscanos hasta llegar al convento de San Francisco de Puebla. Debido a que se desempeñó como fraile limosnero, entró en cercano contacto con los habitantes de la región de Puebla-Tlaxcala, utilizando sus carretas y bueyes para el avituallamiento de su comunidad. Murió el 25 de febrero de 1600 ya con fama de santidad. Su cuerpo, expuesto durante 3 días en la iglesia conventual, manifestó señales prodigiosas, encontrándose algunos meses después incorrupto. Motivado por dichas noticias y fama de santidad, el obispo angelopolitano Diego Romano y Gobea ordenó recopilar entre 1600 y 1604 los testimonios y las informaciones de la vida, origen de los trámites hacia la búsqueda de la beatificación de este personaje. Por lo tanto, la extensa causa de Sebastián de Aparicio se compone por la fase diocesana entre 1600 y 1606 y la fase apostólica que inició en 1625 con la emisión de las letras apostólicas remisoriales o rótulo. En esta segunda etapa se obtuvo el decreto Constare de Fama en 1693 y en 1768 la observancia de las virtudes teologales y cardinales en grado heroico. Finalmente, en 1788, el Papa Pío VI publicó el decreto que reconocía los 2 milagros requeridos para avanzar con la beatificación: la curación de Agustina de Nava y Diego Méndez. La solemnidad finalmente se llevó a cabo en la Basílica de San Pedro el 17 de mayo de 1789. Fray Mateo Jiménez, el postulador, informó dicha noticia al rey Carlos IV en 1790, y cito: queda concluida felizmente en la congregación de ritos la causa del expresado siervo de Dios, estando aprobadas sus virtudes en grado heroico y aquellos milagros que eran necesarios para proceder a beatificarle solemnemente. Esta noticia llegó de inmediato a la Nueva España y sus consecuentes celebraciones tanto en la ciudad de Puebla como en la Ciudad de México. Volviendo a la ciudad de Puebla, tras este nombramiento se autorizó el traslado del cuerpo incorrupto del franciscano a un espacio público para recibir veneración. Y bueno, esta es la imagen que vemos en pantalla, la urna que actualmente conserva el cuerpo incorrupto de este personaje. La beatificación tuvo como consecuencia todo un aparato propagandístico que tuvo a su vez como objetivo la difusión de la efigie del franciscano por medio de estampas, la construcción de estructuras efímeras para los festejos de las solemnidades y una abundante producción pictórica de su efigie y escenas de tipo narrativo. Su iconografía, cuya configuración inició desde el siglo XVII, se definió con claridad tras la beatificación, una vez que fue permitido que sus imágenes portaran señales de santidad y fueran veneradas. Así, se le representó como un fraile franciscano anciano, en compañía de sus carretas y con sus toros y la azucena, símbolo de la pureza, así como la frondosa encina en la que se detenía a orar en la ermita de Nuestra Señora del Destierro, atributos fuertemente asociados a su vida en la región de Puebla-Tlaxcala, así como su condición de fraile limosnero. Aquí observamos las 2 estampas emitidas con motivo de su beatificación, la que circuló en la Nueva España, tanto la que fue emitida en la ciudad de Roma. Dentro de estas obras artísticas producidas tras la beatificación, destaca un grupo de lienzos situados en la ya mencionada capilla de la Virgen Conquistadora del Templo de San Francisco de Puebla, de la autoría del afamado artífice Miguel Jerónimo Cendejas. Esta serie se trata del grupo pictórico más extenso dedicado a un venerable novohispano, y su estudio, poco abordado en la historiografía de la pintura en la Nueva España, presenta varias problemáticas que involucran la ejecución del encargo, la autoría del conjunto y el desarrollo del proyecto, entre las más relevantes. En esta intervención expone algunos de los hallazgos documentales que permiten estudiar la ejecución de la serie a partir del diálogo entre repositorios mexicanos y europeos, entre ellos la Biblioteca del Palacio Real de Madrid, el Fondo Franciscano de la Biblioteca Nacional de México y el Archivo de la Academia de San Lucas de Roma, entre otros. En ese recorrido, el análisis se hará en una especie de retroceso, comenzando por el hallazgo de los dibujos preparatorios de la serie grabada a partir de la cual Cendejas proyectó la serie pictórica. El objetivo nuevamente es reconocer el diálogo entre estas fuentes de origen italiano que culminó con el ejercicio del pintor novohispano. Y bueno, aquí observamos los lienzos de la serie a los que me voy a referir a lo largo de esta presentación. En el clima de la beatificación de Sebastián de Aparicio, destaca la aparición de imágenes de carácter narrativo, siendo la más relevante la colección de estampas que representan los principales pasos, hechos y prodigios de Sebastián de Aparicio, ejecutada en 1789 por el burilista italiano Pietro Leone Bombelli. Los estudios que han abordado este conjunto han atribuido la invención de la serie al burilista. Sin embargo, gracias al descubrimiento por quien suscribe, se reconocieron los dibujos preparatorios inéditos de la autoría de Nicola Gadini, pintor italiano. El hallazgo de este documento, en la colección de diseños que representan los principales pasos, hechos y prodigios del beato Sebastián de Aparicio, se realizó en los fondos de la Biblioteca del Palacio Real de Madrid. El documento contiene 118 hojas de dibujos en papel verjurado, enmarcados en orlas de color verde azulado y filetes gruesos dorados. Los dibujos muestran un bocetado con lápiz de sanguina o grafito y toques realizados a la acuarela con pinceladas de albayalde para crear volúmenes y profundidades. En algunas láminas hay presencia de correcciones realizadas con fragmentos de papel superpuestos al soporte primario. Como textos preliminares posee 2 manuscritos: la dedicatoria del ya mencionado postulador de la causa, Fray Mateo Jiménez, para el rey Carlos IV, y un parecer de la Academia de San Lucas, firmado por el pintor español Francisco Preciado de la Vega, académico y secretario de la institución. Sobre Nicola Gadini, hasta el momento no se conocen datos a profundidad, y está pendiente y en proceso realizar un rastreo de su formación o producción artística en Roma, pues su nombre está ausente en el archivo de la Academia de San Lucas. Por lo tanto, no era miembro al momento de la Academia de San Lucas. En cuanto a la documentación presente en México, ha sido posible ubicarlo en algunos documentos del Fondo Reservado de la Biblioteca Nacional de México. El primero de ellos es el Disegni fatto da Nicola Gadini y revisio del padre reverendísimo Sejudo en el convento de Araceli. Este documento, escrito en italiano, manuscrito, aparecen brevemente explicados algunos dibujos de esta serie. Después de las especificaciones de cada diseño, se encuentra la firma de Fray Juan Fernández Sejudo, el entonces procurador de la causa, el 7 de agosto de 1718, y da indicaciones al señor Leonardo Libri, síndico de la causa en Roma, para pagarle a Gadini la cantidad de 139 escudos por los diseños acordados. En una segunda carta sin fecha, parece que el papel de Gadini parece haber concluido después, pues el autor, se infiere que se trata de Fray Juan Fernández de Sejudo, informa que ya no se servirá de sus obras en lo subsecuente. A partir de estas noticias documentales, es posible situar la hechura de estos dibujos aproximadamente en 1718, ya que el documento de la Biblioteca Real está fechado en 1789, como se verá más adelante. Acerca de la calidad de los dibujos, el autor utilizó numerosos recursos para situar los pasajes de la vida del ego, tales como escenarios arquitectónicos, paisajes de gran profundidad y resolución de varios planos en la misma escena, teniendo como resultado imágenes narrativas de gran calidad y detalle, como se puede observar en la imagen. El artista probablemente desarrolló las escenas siguiendo las directrices de alguna hagiografía, pudiendo ser en específico La Vita Miracoli del Venerabile Servo di Dio, Fray Sebastiano de Aparicio, de Paolo Marini, escrita e impresa en Roma en el año de 1695. También por venia del entonces postulador Fray Juan Fernández de Cejudo, y en aquel momento la hagiografía más actual que se podía conseguir en la ciudad de Roma. Volviendo a los preliminares de la colección de diseños, Mateo Jiménez, procurador de la causa, señala en el texto preliminar que desde que, cito, me hallé con esta colección de diseños, puse toda la posible atención y cuidado en informarme de su mérito. Con esta noticia se confirma que no fue él quien encargó la realización de estos dibujos, sino que los encontró ya ejecutados. Al hallarlos, Jiménez decidió darles algún destino, y citó, a fin de que no quedasen sepultados en el olvido. Y con esta idea los sometió al juicio de los profesores de la Academia de San Lucas, para que diesen su dictamen, y al parecer, como cita a Jiménez, celebraron y aplaudieron su perfección. Jiménez nuevamente detalla que para dar mayor veracidad a la calidad de los dibujos, Francisco Preciado, secretario de la Academia de San Lucas, firmó el 15 de mayo de 1789 una aprobación donde consideró dignos estos dibujos de presentarse a un señor o príncipe amante de Sebastián de Aparicio.
Perdón, Montserrat.
Sí.
Me preguntan si puedes ir un poco más lento.
Ay, sí, una
no,
disculpa.
no pasa nada.
Sí.
Gracias.
Muy bien. Ok, entonces este juicio lo he ubicado recientemente en los libros de decretos de la Academia de San Lucas, donde efectivamente se informa que este personaje presentó una cantidad de dibujos que contenían diversas piezas del venerable siervo de Dios Sebastián de Aparicio. Y cito, como pueden ver en la imagen, que la Academia no solo aprobó el mérito de los mismos, sino que los declaró dignos de ser presentados a cualquier príncipe. Es posible que en este punto Jiménez haya buscado el patrocinio real para que estos diseños fueran después trasladados a planchas y estampados como serie, pues en los preliminares nuevamente expresa dicha voluntad, con la frase, y cito, no me queda libertad para hacer otra elección a quien dedicar estos mismos, que hacia augusta y real persona, dirigiéndose al rey. Ofrézcolos, por tanto, gustoso a las reales plantas. Y a continuación tenemos el segundo momento, que se trata de la serie estampada de Pietro Leone Bombelli, que toma como origen los ya mencionados dibujos de Nicola Gadin. Tenemos entonces este compendio de la vida de Sebastián de Aparicio, publicado en 1789, y que es la última biografía que aparece de Aparicio, y a la par se publica esta serie, como ya mencioné, ejecutada por Pietro León Bombelli, que es la que vemos en la pantalla. Inicialmente, en la historiografía se asumió que estos grabados fueron pensados para ilustrar la geografía de Jiménez, pero hasta el momento, en ninguna de las ediciones que yo he revisado aparecen en conjunto con la biografía. Sin embargo, sí estaban destinados a fungir como parte de la iconografía oficial post-beatificación, y es el único ejemplo en la que podemos observar las escenas de la vida de Sebastián de Aparicio de forma completa y minuciosa. La elección de Pietro León Bombelli como grabador de la serie probablemente se debe a la fama que ya poseía para el último tercio del siglo XVIII, como lo testifica Nicolás Cruz y Vagamonde, comisionario de la Real Academia de Bellas Artes de Cádiz, quien lo incluyó en su monumental obra Viaje de España, Francia e Italia como un grabador de mérito. Este personaje, alumno de Girolamo Frezza y del pintor Stefano Pozzi, desarrolló su labor principalmente en la ciudad de Roma, y con algunos importantes encargos gestionados por la Basílica Vaticana y el cardenal duque de York. Hay que señalar también que ejecutó como inventor o incisor las estampas de otros personajes cuyos procesos de beatificación y canonización estaban activos al mismo tiempo que los de Sebastián de Aparicio. Solo por mencionar algunos, María de Jesús de Ágreda, el franciscano Antonio Margil, la quiteña Mariana de Jesús Paredes y Torres, el patriarca Juan de Rivera y los jesuitas Joseph Anchieta y Juan Bautista de Chisky. En cuanto a la ejecución de las planchas, Bombelli prácticamente respeta los diseños de Gadini, no incluye ninguna escena de su invención, con excepción del retrato de Sebastián de Aparicio, que es el que vemos en la imagen. El hecho de que en el repositorio de la Biblioteca Real también se encuentre a la par de los dibujos inéditos esta serie grabada, sugiere que el rey efectivamente accedió a financiar su ejecución, aunque queda pendiente dar mayor sustento a esta hipótesis por medio de una revisión documental más exhaustiva. Cabe señalar que existen otras ediciones de estos grabados que se han ubicado, por ejemplo, en la biblioteca de la Universidad de Harvard o en la John Carter Brown Library, y recientemente se han subastado 2 de estas series. Y ya para el tercer momento hablaremos de Miguel Jerónimo Cendejas y de la serie pictórica que, como ya mencioné, tiene su origen en estos dibujos y en esta serie grabada. Y bueno, se encuentran, como ya mencionaba, en la capilla de la Virgen Conquistadora, en los muros, tanto del lado del Evangelio como del lado de la Epístola. Se debe a los historiadores del arte, Pedro Ángeles y Montserrat Galí, el descubrimiento de la relación entre los grabados y los lienzos. Están firmados por Cendejas en el año de 1809. Sin embargo, como ya señala Pedro Ángeles Jiménez, se pueden reconocer 2 momentos pictóricos en la hechura de esta serie. Cuestión en la que no voy a ahondar por tiempo. Bueno, dentro de estos lienzos son de especial interés los que conforman los 4 conjuntos que vemos en las imágenes. En estos se muestran episodios y portentos clave de la vida de Aparicio, iniciando, por ejemplo, con su milagrosa curación, siendo niño por acción de una loba que le lame una llaga. Y tenemos también, por ejemplo, su partida hacia la Nueva España, que podemos ver en la segunda imagen. Y luego también tenemos, por ejemplo, la escena que nos muestra su declaración de beatitud. Otros momentos importantes es la doma de animales, que era uno de los milagros que se le atribuyen a Aparicio. Y tenemos también, por ejemplo, algunos milagros, algunas curaciones, etc. Analizando la construcción de estos conjuntos, su orden en el armado no obedece a una intencionalidad determinada, sino más bien a la necesidad de ajustarlos para encajar en las prolongaciones, en los muros. Por eso vemos que no hay una secuencia cronológica en el armado de estas escenas. Asimismo, se aprecian algunos rellenos, algunos elementos que no tienen concordancia, pero que se utilizaron para darle una forma uniforme al conjunto. El formato de las obras, de las escenas, como se puede observar, es apaisado y está conformado por 1 o 2 escenas delimitadas por una línea vertical de color rojo, así como la presencia de tarjas situadas en los extremos derecho o izquierdo, de manera que no interfieren significativamente con las composiciones. La
Perdón,
paleta,
Montserrat,
sí,
quedan 5 minutos, perdón.
sí,
Gracias.
gracias. Bueno, tenemos que la paleta cromática se perfila entre los azules, rojos y marrones, característica de la pintura novohispana del siglo XVIII. Vemos que también tenemos la capa pictórica adelgazada, lo que permite apreciar elementos que fueron trabajados uno sobre el otro conforme el artista estaba decidiendo cómo modificar la composición. Y vemos que aunque la mayoría están basados en los grabados de Bombelli, presentan algunas particularidades que hablan del quehacer del artífice. Hay que recordar que el uso de grabados en el ámbito novohispano proporcionaba al artista modelos concretos que podían resultar de gran ayuda a la hora de construir una composición. Em, Sin embargo, en este caso, los grabados del italiano fueron utilizados como modelo, pero el artífice estableció un diálogo realizando un ejercicio que le llevó a sopesar lo que le funcionaba o no en las composiciones, eliminando lo que no le servía y adecuando los contenidos al formato en el que estaba trabajando. También vemos que hay algunas libertades que se da el artista para darle un cariz un poco más novohispano. Ahora no traigo ningún ejemplo, pero está presente en varias de las escenas de este primer ciclo. Bueno, ya para ir concluyendo, vemos que se integran en estas escenas la tarja con la octava real, que nos explican qué es lo que está sucediendo en cada una de las escenas. Y también tenemos la inclusión de escenas, como mencionaba, de la propia invención del autor, que están ausentes tanto de la serie de Gadini como de la serie de Bombelli. Aquí vemos un ejemplo de cómo se realizó el trasunto entre el dibujo, el grabado de Bombelli, que como mencionaba, respeta prácticamente los diseños del predecesor, y la adecuación que realiza Cendejas para el espacio de lienzo en la capilla. Y bueno, ya para concluir, los lienzos de la serie de la Vía del Beato Sebastián de Aparicio son obras que reflejan el complejo ejercicio de la pintura novohispana en las postrimerías del siglo XVIII. En esta intervención se presentó brevemente algunas pautas del diálogo entre las fuentes gráficas de origen italiano, comenzando con los dibujos preparatorios de Nicola Gadini, encargados con la concomitancia de la Orden Franciscana, y los postuladores de la causa de beatificación de Aparicio, hasta el ejercicio de Miguel Jerónimo Cendejas, el artífice novohispano, quien a partir del análisis y apropiación de los grabados de Bombelli, adecuó las escenas de la vida de Aparicio a las necesidades del espacio físico o a las necesidades narrativas de la santidad del personaje. Y bueno, recalcar que este personaje hasta la fecha tiene una gran veneración en Puebla, por lo tanto estas pinturas continúan formando parte de la narrativa que los devotos contemplan al acercarse a venerar la reliquia. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Montserrat. Era fascinante, la verdad, ver el proceso desde los dibujos hasta las pinturas de Cendejas. Now I think, Nicola, that we're going to have the questions, right? Or in the discussion?
I think we left it rather a long time in the first session, I'm afraid. So, but yeah, so now
Okay.
we have a discussion about these three, and then we'll have a quick break, just a 5-minute break, and then we'll carry on for the last ones.
Sorry, can I just ask one quick question? Very, very quickly, very interesting.
Thank you.
I don't know if this is completely mapped, but when you describe these sacrificial practices and the women seizing this lithe young man and tearing him to pieces, that reminded me of Euripides the Bacchae. And I wondered, and the very interesting images you showed of a mother suckling out a child, Eve, so that's often. I can't help thinking, I'm not doubting that there wasn't a real event, but I can't help thinking some of this comes from sort of literary, sort of making something more mythical than perhaps it was. I don't know. But
Thank you. I think this is a very perceptive, actually, view of yours, because that's the thing. How reliable are Vespucci's descriptions, isn't it? And of course, we think about all the references that were playing a part at the back of his mind, just as with Columbus's letters as well. So all the associations and analogies. Which again are very understandable in this encounter with a new world, because you're faced with something that is so new that you lack a proper vocabulary to make sense of it and to report.
And if you think for a long time, Narwhal haunts were considered unicorn walks.
Absolutely.
People believed in unicorns. Lots of things were considered absolutely correct.
Exactly. So the borders between fiction and fact are what makes all this so fascinating to my view, because it's not just about, how reliable, how true. They were true to these chroniclers in a way. Of course, we may argue that Vespucci is embellishing and dramatizing elements which he actually experienced. But you're absolutely right about the classical references. And of course, some of you might have thought about the witch trials, which are in full swing, especially in Germany in the 16th century, 17th century. So some of these depictions of indigenous women delighting in the cannibal ritual and consuming human flesh, it ties in with the view of, the witch, the female witch. Exactly.
Right, add to this, Vargas Llosa, in his book, The Fish in the Water, the Peruvian novelist, describes researching in the archives at the University of Peru and finding these really interesting descriptions which were a fusion of European medieval myths and legends and things that people were encountering. So I thought of that, but I also thought of the Tiepolo frescoes in the bishop's residence in Würzburg, where you have these extraordinary scenes, the most amazing scenes of America, where you have this Amazonian princess with a feathered bonnet sitting astride an alligator, and you have these 5 severed heads by a bonfire. It's a marvelous thing.
You must give me this reference, please. I don't know.
It has America, Africa, Europe, and Asia. It's the most marvelous series of frescoes. It takes days really to look at. I actually spent almost a week.
I must get this room.
Partly because as a New Zealander, you probably took my accent. I'm just very interested in that moment of Europeans confronting the new world. And I think that Tiepolo is absolutely engaging with what he thinks the new world is like. Somebody knows it's based on stories. And it's a tremendous sequence. It's worth getting on the train and going there. It really is.
I feel like doing this just now. Thank you.
Where did you say Susan? Susan, where was it? So Susan is an artist.
Yes,
she comes at this from an artistic.
yeah.
It's
the bishop's residence in Würzburg,
Würzburg.
in southern Bavaria. It's open every day, and it's open all day. And it's marvelous. There's no restricted entry. It's the biggest fresco sequence. It's bigger than the Sistine Chapel, actually. And because it was bombed by the RAF, first it was firebombed, closed the war. The war had 2 weeks to run. That palace was firebombed, but somehow the plaster ceiling remained intact. It was restored in about 2006, wasn't it? Quite recently. It's absolutely beautiful.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. You should write a paper on this.
I have suggested it to a magazine and they didn't take me up because it preoccupies me. But the other thing just to mention is that on every New Zealand festival there's actually a figure of an English figure, like a silk, called the New Zealand flag, and on the other side there's a Maori warrior in our festivals, which I always love. And that lovely image towards the end that you showed us made me really think about that, where there's one figure, dark figure, a black man on one side and a white slender woman on the other side, and then you talked about the American woman at the base and Europe at the top. Like Würzburg, actually, just the same idea, isn't it? Yeah.
Thank
you very much, Ribbit. So
thank you. Yes.
Vivian, thank you so much for such an interesting and beautiful paper. I was wondering, because there are the Spuch's blackers, and then there is this person who was imprisoned himself and feared for his life that he might be beaten. But you showed a lot of images by different authors. And my understanding is that not all of those authors were in Brazil. So they are not witnesses, like persons or anything. So there is a series of copying images, and probably everyone adds something. And then there is this formation of the myth of cannibalism, like, well, is that true? Because not all of them. Who are they copying?
Yeah, so sorry. I had to go really fast, and I appreciate that I put lots of things together which didn't necessarily fall into a clear narrative. You're absolutely right. You had a few travelers who went to Brazil and left accounts. So these, we refer to them as sort of chroniclers, travel writers. So Vespucci is one of them. And we have Léry, you will remember from the one of the early slides.
Sure.
So Jean de Léry and Rétévé. So you have these Portuguese travelers wouldn't leave accounts because Portugal had a policy of secrecy about its new colony. And therefore, any description of Brazil in the 16th century made by the Portuguese would remain a secret of state, a state secret. So the accounts we have, the early accounts, are mostly from non-Portuguese sources like Vespucci, Léry, Staden, the German guy who was imprisoned in Brazil. So his book was a huge sensation. And as I said, it's sort of the first detailed ethnographic description of the habits of the Tupinambá. So he doesn't write only about cannibalism. It's a fantastic source of information about, ritual practices, communal life, everyday, the language, etc. But I got lost. But the printers, the people who created the images, just like the map makers, they would rely on travelers' accounts.
Yeah, that's exactly. They relied on somebody's words.
Yeah.
They actually didn't bring any images, so they were reading and then they were creating images.
But in Staden's case, some of
and then it has been repeated.
well, exactly, like you saw the pamphlet, the Antwerp pamphlet repeats some of those images. They are stock images that then become eternalized. That's part of my point, exactly.
There's a big market for this imagery of individuals from other cultures. People don't just want to read accounts, they want to visualize.
Yes. But Staden apparently created some of those woodcuts. You will see if you leaf through the first edition, you have different levels of quality, and some are very, very basic, and they're believed to have been based on drawings by Staden himself. So could have been,
Yeah, I'm now thinking of the statues of the copy and replica, original and the copy. There was no original image, so to speak. Like, who saw it never drew it. So the original is in words. Actually.
Absolutely. It's just like the rhinoceros, remember?
Yes.
It's a good example of this kind of thing, of hearsay and then create an image based on a description you heard about.
But there's some wonderful, like an AI image.
Oh, yeah.
But there's some wonderful early Netherlandish prints, aren't there? I'm just trying to remember of America and Asia.
Really long.
Yes, yeah.
Something.
Is that Brokebear?
Yes.
Brokebear. No, but there's somebody, I'm thinking of somebody else as well, somebody really famous who did some very beautiful prints of 16th century Flemish. Yeah, I think Devos, that's right. That have Africa, Asia, Europe. Exactly. And those are done in 1550 or something like that, quite early. So already those images are being, taken to Northern Europe and everywhere. Yeah. Great.
Vivian,
Yes.
it's very interesting because studying the iconography of the witches in Europe, there are quite very strong links with the way those European travelers used to draw the Indians, so the indigenous, the female indigenous. So it seems that they have a pattern, a pattern of female or femininity, which was a pattern which was not, which is a pattern of a woman who was not, who didn't have a behavior which was expected by that society, by European society at the 15th century or Renaissance. So if you look at those images and the description of those women and you compare with the indigenous femininity, you see that there are quite a lot of bridges between them, and it's very, very interesting to have a look into this iconography, which is quite, which is vast, it's big. There are lots of images of the witch seen from the 14th century, 15th century, 16th century in Europe, and the way they were represented, and the way the indigenous female were represented by the European travelers.
Exactly. No, absolutely. This reminds me that Theodore Depries, a prince, reworkings of Staden's prints, they really emphasize this hypersexuality and voluptuousness of
Exactly.
the women during the cannibal ritual. So if you compare the image that appears in Staden and then in Depries, it's incredible how much there is really an overlap with the image of the witch, the female witch, and how, you know, she delights in drinking blood or whatever it is.
Exactly.
It's the position of sexuality and violence, which is very much part of this imagination, and it's fascinating, I think.
Yes. And the other point I'd like to highlight as well was when you were talking about the Tupinambá mantle, that talking to the cacique of the Tupinambás, I don't know how to say cacique, sorry, in English. Cacique.
The tribal leader, or
exactly, the tribal leader. She's a female, actually. She lives in Bahia. And when the mantle came, she said that the mantle should be buried. Because it belonged to a warrior who died, you know, with that mount. So there is no sense at all for them, you know, them indigenous population, to see the mantle there in a museum. In a museum is a very imperial conception of you know, a European conception of keeping things and just leaving things there for people see, you know, how different. I mean, these other populations who live on the other side of the world. Anyway, so for the indigenous Tupinambá indigenous, they just don't agree with the mantle in the museum. They should have the mantle to bury them.
Yeah, it's a very
anthropological
discussion, isn't it? About that's a whole discussion in museology about artifacts that were brought from other cultures and are currently held in museums. It's a very
complex
and how can museums keep these items but make them accessible and sort of, anyway, it's a long discussion, maybe for another event.
Yeah.
But there was one. I'm sorry.
What's caption on it in the cable?
The mantle, the Tupinambá mantle, where in the museum in Denmark. In Ibirapema.
What's caption?
What did they call it at the museum?
I think it's sorry, I should have put that. I think it's Brazilian club, war club.
No explanation about its function.
Oh no, not at all. No.
It's just a very beautiful museum, you know.
Yes, I know the museum. I'm just very interested in how things are displayed.
Yeah,
It's a diplomatic museum, though.
Yeah, I know. I think.
Reasons you know.
Yeah.
I don't know. I know some museums, including ULA, have returned some items which are considered to be so historically important to the people who originally had them, that it isn't right to have them in Geese and museum in London. It just feels absolutely.
I think it's a very complex thing, to be honest. I don't have strong views in that. For many years, I researched a manuscript that is an extremely rare, precious manuscript that was stolen from a library in Brazil by pirates, and it's currently held in Oxford. And to be honest, it's in pristine condition. And had it been kept there, it wouldn't have survived.
Okay, I think we need to stop. We need to get back, because that is, as you say, another whole
Sorry about it.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, it is true. No, I was facetious about Caperoni because it's very French to think, it's very beautiful.
And I'm a museum person. I love museums, and I don't want to say it's an everything back, but it's, you can see why for some people it's very emotional and it's not.
Of course, it's
straightforward. Yeah.
absolutely, you're right.
Akemi, take charge of us.
Sorry, I can't.
No, don't worry. No, I wanted congratulations to the three of you. Fascinating presentations. And I had three questions, observations. Maybe I'll say the three of them and then each one of you can comment or answer. My first question was for Montserrat. I was very interested in the incorrupt body of Sebastián de Aparicio. I was wondering if you could tell us more about the cult of the body and if it was painted or represented from, the representation of the body. I'm quite curious about that. For Claudia, something that I found very interesting about your market scene is that the figure looking at you and also the style and forefronting the tropical fruits reminded me a lot of this Mexican artist, Jose Agustin Arrieta, and specifically his portrait of the young man from the coast at the Hispanic Society. So I don't know if there were exchanges as well with other Latin American countries during that period, but I would be curious to know about pictorial traditions and exchanges between them, perhaps. And then I think my last observations as question for Vivian was that I recently was in Denmark, and it was interesting because I saw the Albert Eekhout paintings, and now that I think about it, it was the woman that had the basket with the limbs of in these portraits. I don't know if this continues from this tradition that you were saying of representing the woman as the cannibal or empowered in that sense. So yes, thank you so much.
Let's go to Montserrat first. Let's
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Kenny, for your question. And actually, my thesis dissertation on master's history was about that, about the cult of the body, the incorrupt body. So it is quite interesting to see how, since the beginning of the cause of beatification, the body was there. The people in Puebla knew that there was this holy body, and it received a lot of veneration, but from behind the scenes, because as you probably all of you know, because of the decrees of Urban VIII, it was not possible to venerate relics of a person that was not already beatified. So it was not possible. So the memory of this body was still alive among the Franciscans in the city of Puebla. The body was preserved inside one of the altars of the Church of San Francisco, and then in the sacristy. So it was not a dangerous aspect of the cult during the process of beatification. But then after the decree of beatification, it was possible to venerate this body. So that I was, I don't know if I was very clear, but during my presentation, but it was after the decree that the body came into the public eye again in the chapel that I presented. And probably this was between 1719 or 1791, and from that time until this day, the incorrupt body is venerated in that space, and that is why it is also quite important to see these paintings about the life of the blessed, because it explains all his virtues, all his miracles. And the body was not exactly represented in these paintings. Just a moment when the blessed was recently died, and there's a miracle where it explains the usual pathos of the holy body, that being old and with wrinkles and dried skin, it turned into a beautiful face with white skin and without wrinkles and with a glimpse of beauty. So this is the only representation that I have found so far about this holy body. And then you have the relic right there. And people it is very interesting because nowadays I think it is most popular to have it is most popular the image of the incorrupt body than the image of the blessed that was popular back in the 18th century. If you go to Puebla, you're going to get a stampa, I don't know the word in English.
Yes, a devotional kind of card or
Yeah, exactly. You're gonna get the one with the body, not with the image of the saint. So I don't know if this answers your question. And just to say something else, this dissertation was recently published. It is open to public, so if you want to read it, I can share in the chat the link to download it.
Please do. Yes, would love to see it. Thank you so much, Montserrat.
Thank you.
Made of wax, which it looks like. It surely isn't actually.
And there is a question here.
Yes.
Is the actual figure that we see made of wax? Because it surely isn't a human body.
Yeah, it is. It is actually a very controversial thing because it is indeed the body, but it is in a very fragmented condition, and the face is the skull is covered with a mask made of wax.
Absolutely, yeah. That's what it looks like.
Yes. But the body is indeed there, and there are a lot of a lot of inspections all the way until the end of the 18th century about the condition of the body. So the thing that we see nowadays is the wax mask and the body covered with the garments of the order.
Okay, thank you.
So maybe can we have Claudia, when you respond to Akemi's?
Yes.
Might take a break just for 5.
All right. Okay. Unfortunately, Akemi, I don't know that artist that you mentioned, but going through the catalogs of the exhibitions from 1850 to the end of the 19th century, I think it was it was very improbably that there were in fact an exchange between Latin American artists and Brazilian artists. Although I think Ana Cavalcante would be maybe she would talk more about that exchange of artists between Brazil and Latin America at that time. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you.
I've got the picture. Let me see if I put it near my camera, if everybody can see it. Can you see that?
Yeah. Yes.
It's a really beautiful painting.
It is.
You can hear more about this on the Athena YouTube, because I always find a way to mention Athena. I did a podcast with Madeleine Haddon, a curator, an American curator who's now working in London, but she curated an exhibition at the Hispanic last year or the year before about their collections and sort of and she put that painting, I think it was that painting, next to a Velázquez, and she was kind of talking about the relationships between the two. So it's a very interesting podcast, and she talks about this particular painter who he's an African American painter, a painter of African descent, and she talks about something I didn't know, which is how many African people arrived in Mexico, because that was one of the places I think it was near Veracruz where they arrived, and then they sort of dispersed to other parts of America. So, and there were more enslaved people in Mexico at one point than there were in North America. So many more, yeah, yeah. So anyway, it's a very interesting story about this.
It wasn't the case in Brazil.
Oh, yeah, Brazil is a record-breaking in terms of slavery. Yeah,
More than 800% of the population were black and enslaved.
yeah. But it would be interesting to know about the relationship, wouldn't it, between
Exactly.
yeah.
Very, very interesting.
The
Custom paintings are similar sort of feeling.
Yeah, yes, because some of them, they do actually have exotic objects
Yeah.
or lovely fruits and things in them, don't they?
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
Well, look, if I think let's break for 5 minutes and then we're in the home straight. We've got 2 more talks.
Without further ado, I would love to introduce Dr. Rafael Ramos. He is a professor of Hispano-American History of Art at the Universidad de Sevilla and visiting researcher at the Instituto Ribagüero of the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Perú. He has participated in 5 I+D+I Ministry of Economy research projects, and is the author of several publications about the art of Viceregal Lima, most recently including Patronazgo Artístico del Obispo Virrey Don Diego Ladrón de Guevara en Lima, and Sculpture at Home in Baroque Lima in Materiality Making Spanish America. Thank you.
Yo hablaré en español y espero que pueda ser de interés. En primer lugar, sobre todo agradecer la invitación a la doctora Jennings y a la Carnegie Foundation para participar en este simposio, ¿no? Al final he titulado el trabajo como Pintura y coleccionismo en Lima en el siglo XVII y trata de ser una aportación al conocimiento de la práctica del coleccionismo pictórico en Lima, la capital del...
Un poco más fuerte, sí, por favor.
Sí.
Gracias, perfecto. Y me dices cuando cambio la pantalla, ¿ok?
Sí, te voy diciendo.
Vale.
Como decía, el presente trabajo trata de ser una aportación al conocimiento de la práctica del coleccionismo pictórico en Lima, la capital del extenso virreinato del Perú. Se ha hecho una aportación importante sobre el coleccionismo del siglo XVIII alrededor de la colección de Pedro José Bravo de Laguna en 1765, pero no están claros los orígenes que suponemos y planteamos en este trabajo que pudo ser a lo largo del siglo XVII. Hay que anotar que en Lima o México fueron las capitales de los virreinatos americanos y por tanto al frente de ella estaba el virrey, que pertenecía a la gran aristocracia española. La presencia del virrey y su corte pues generaba un modo de vida y costumbres cortesanos en América, alrededor, sobre todo en sus capitales, y también ese modo cortesano pues también estaría presente en las artes. En España el gran coleccionista fue Felipe IV y a imitación de él comenzó la aristocracia a crear sus colecciones. El coleccionismo pictórico como afición y práctica debió de nacer y desarrollarse en las grandes casas limeñas, la siguiente fotografía, las grandes casas limeñas de la que se conservan algunos testimonios documentales y algunos ejemplos muy tardíos como el que estamos viendo en la pantalla. Desde la fundación de Lima en 1535 fue generándose una tipología arquitectónica de vivienda particular con su ajuar, de tal modo que la casa y su ajuar llegaron a ser una carta de presentación y prestigio en la sociedad limeña. Se invirtieron muchos miles de pesos en su construcción, decoración y mantenimiento, convirtiéndose en un símbolo de un estatus social, la imagen del linaje familiar, y generándose una competición entre los ricos habitantes para demostrar su autoridad, su poder, sus gustos personales. Nosotros nos apoyamos en nuestra investigación en los inventarios de bienes de estos personajes de la alta sociedad limeña. La tónica general de estos interiores sugiere un carácter variopinto, con cierto sentido de acumulación de objetos suntuarios, un gusto ecléctico expresando la riqueza de los propietarios. Es decir, estos interiores, lo que conocemos de ellos todavía, estarían más bien en la línea del afán psicológico de posesión, propio del tesoro y de la Kunstkammer. Sabemos cuáles fueron las distintas estancias principales de la casa acomodada. La sala principal, la siguiente, la sala del estrado, que aparece en el grabado de Fressier, en la siguiente fotografía, ahí lo ven ustedes. Si ustedes se fijan, es la sala del estrado, que era donde estaba habitualmente la mujer, la señora de la casa, y si se fijan, al fondo aparecen las paredes pinturas de arcángeles arcabuceros. Junto con la sala del estrado, los dormitorios, patio, corredores, el estudio o librería, el oratorio. Precisamente creo y he propuesto en otra publicación el proponer esa habitación del estudio, que aparece así citada en la documentación, a veces asociada a la librería, como el espacio en el que pudo ir germinando el sentido del coleccionismo pictórico, es decir, la selección de un tipo de pinturas por su valor artístico, según un gusto personal. Lógicamente, en el mundo hispano, los temas más frecuentes de la pintura fueron los temas religiosos y devocionales. Así, por ejemplo, la iconografía de Cristo, la Virgen María y los santos se enumeran una y otra vez. Por ejemplo, podemos dar a conocer la siguiente fotografía, aparece Santa María Egipciaca. Es una bella pintura muy poco conocida, de finales del siglo XVII y que creemos de ascendencia napolitana. Se encuentra en el Museo de Historia de Lima. También otros temas religiosos del Antiguo Testamento, como por ejemplo escenas de la vida de Abraham o los hijos o tribus de Jacob. Hay constancia de la llegada de pintura madrileña, de Flandes, escuelas italianas, así como centros virreinales como Cuzco, Quito o México. De México es en la siguiente fotografía, llegaron estas pinturas del famoso Herrera de México, así aparece citado en la documentación limeña. Sin duda alguna era Alonso López de Herrera, muy conocido por sus Verónicas, como esta que vamos viendo en la pantalla. En esa misma línea, Gonzalo Arias, un rico comerciante, citaba en su testamento, en 1650, 8 lienzos de ermitaños y 13 sibilas de este pintor, de López de Herrera. También estuvieron presentes las obras de la Escuela de los Basanos. Se puede ver en la siguiente fotografía una serie que se conserva en la Catedral de Lima de los meses del año, que fue donada por el arzobispo virrey Liñán y Cisnero. Uno de los asuntos pictóricos que demuestra la consolidación y la personalidad cultural del virreinato fueron las vistas de paisajes locales. El número y variedad va creciendo con el paso de los años, manifestando protagonismo cada vez mayor en la cultura visual del barroco hispanoamericano. Así, en 1671, el canónigo Agustín de Aler contaba en su casa con 92 pinturas, entre las que se encontraba, como vemos en la siguiente fotografía, un país de la ciudad de Lima. En la siguiente fotografía, sí, ahí se puede ver, es un cuadro que se conserva en el Museo de América, procedente de una colección particular sevillana. O, por ejemplo, este canónigo tenía también un país de las ninfas del Parnaso. y varios retratos. Los retratos, como se puede ver en la siguiente fotografía, son cada vez más frecuentes también y realizados por los pintores locales. Este es el retrato de la marquesa de Villafuerte, Constanza de Luján, un anónimo limeño de finales del siglo XVII que se conserva en una iglesia del País Vasco. También empezaron a tomar interés y protagonismo las advocaciones marianas de la Virgen, con iconografías locales. La más frecuente citada en los inventarios es la Virgen de Copacabana, desde su santuario a las orillas del lago Titicaca. Pero también hemos consignado por primera vez entre las pinturas del general Juan de Bengolea en 1675 un lienzo, como el que vamos a ver a continuación, un lienzo de Nuestra Señora de Pomata. Este que estamos viendo en la fotografía pertenece a la Fundación Toma en Estados Unidos y además está fechado en 1669. Es un anónimo andino y nos da cuenta de una imagen temprana de esas iconografías marianas típicas de la pintura andina. Como vemos, se trata de una imagen de la Virgen del Rosario, una escultura del siglo XVI en madera policromada, pero que aparece vestida con ricos ropajes y adornos, en una composición frontal sobre un altar, en un subgénero pictórico de tipo devocional que se le ha llamado trampantojo a lo divino o esculturas pintadas. En este ambiente artístico limeño, que se caracteriza sobre todo por tener un carácter muy internacional en la pintura, sobre todo en el 17 por lo menos, en este contexto artístico, como digo, hay que destacar la existencia de una mujer pintora, una pintora mujer, la limeña Juana de Valera. Ella, al quedar viuda, hizo un inventario de los bienes de su casa en 1667 y se cuentan un total de 127 lienzos, de los cuales 68 eran pintados por Juana de Valera. La mayoría son de tipo religioso y devocional, y recuerda mucho a las series que realizó Zurbarán. Desgraciadamente no se ha conservado ninguno, no se ha identificado ninguno de esos lienzos pintados por la limeña Juana de Valera. Vamos a detenernos especialmente en los inventarios de bienes de algunos propietarios donde aparecen temas humanísticos, no solamente religiosos, y que son los que pueden despertar pues un poco ese concepto de coleccionismo pictórico en este siglo XVII que, como digo, a lo largo del siglo XVII, sobre todo en la segunda mitad del siglo, pues seguramente es cuando nació esa costumbre por el coleccionismo pictórico que de momento simplemente estamos planteando. Así, por ejemplo, el clérigo Pedro de Castillo, que era de origen sevillano, pero un hombre que hizo el testamento e inventario de sus bienes y entre ellos destacan 12 lienzos de la Pasión hechos en Roma, varios retratos, 12 sibilas, y uno que era la herrería de Vulcano y otro el convite de los dioses, temas mitológicos. Pero sin duda el más interesante es un lienzo que dice: un lienzo grande atravesado de 2 varas y cuarta de largo del descendimiento de la cruz, de mano del famoso morisco de Madrid. Suponemos que sería Juan Pareja, el esclavo y discípulo de Velázquez. Así pues, estaba presente en Lima un ejemplo de la mejor pintura limeña del momento. Otro de esos propietarios de abundantes pinturas es el oidor de la Real Audiencia, Bartolomé de Salazar, donde consigna, por ejemplo, una serie de los 12 patriarcas, o por ejemplo, el Arca de Noé, 13 retratos de los distintos virreyes y gobernantes, sería una especie de galería de gobernantes o de reyes, varios retratos, el suyo y el de su esposa, retratos de poetas, temas mitológicos como Venus y Cupido, Andrómeda y Psique, o incluso también, como vemos en el siguiente ejemplo, la fotografía siguiente, una vista de la Plaza de Madrid. Se cita expresamente además en su vivienda la sala llamada estudio, además de centenares de libros que denotan el carácter intelectual de su trabajo. Un personaje muy interesante es un capitán y mercader de origen sevillano, tal vez de origen judío, no lo sabemos, Laureano Jacinto Gelder. Gelder es un apellido que no es muy frecuente. Y en 1675 se hizo un inventario de sus bienes. Poseía decenas y decenas de pinturas, por ejemplo, las tribus con sus bastidores, 12 cuadros de la vida de Adán, 22 lienzos de príncipes de distintos reinos, retratos del rey y de la reina, el Santo Cristo de Burgos, o por ejemplo, el más significativo desde el punto de vista devocional, en el siguiente, es un retrato, dice un retrato de 3 varas de Nuestra Señora de los Reyes, la patrona de Sevilla. Aquí vemos una imagen de la Virgen de los Reyes de Bernabé de Ayala, que se conserva en Lima, en la Casa de Pilatos de Lima. Otro criollo limeño fue el doctor Esteban de Ibarra, canónigo, maestrescuela de la catedral y personaje del Santo Oficio, de la Santa Inquisición. Cuando falleció se hizo una almoneda pública de sus bienes, que fueron sobre todo las pinturas tasadas no por un escribano cualquiera, sino por otros 2 pintores. De modo que eso significa que eran pinturas de calidad y pinturas costosas. El total se contaron nada menos que 208 cuadros y láminas. Con numerosos, parecía que tenía un gusto especial por las flores y los floreros, que llegan a 59 cuadros. También aparecen 32 lienzos devocionales, 7 mitológicos, 18 lienzos del Antiguo Testamento, 14 con los meses del año, 6 arboledas, varios retratos y una vista de la villa de Huancavelica. Incluso se hizo también una almoneda y el cuadro más costoso fue precisamente el que veremos a continuación, un ejemplo que es la batalla de Pavía. Pongo este ejemplo que se encuentra en el Museo de Birmingham, no porque sea el que cita la documentación, sino para mostrar el tema que se estaba representando y que estaba también en Lima. Fue el cuadro más caro, un lienzo grande del cerco de Pavía, que estaba con una moldura dorada, situado en la sala principal. Con un valor de 200 pesos. Eso es un precio muy elevado para la época. También había un cuadro de Venus y Adonis, un cuadro de tema mitológico, por 100 pesos, que también es un precio muy elevado. Otro de los ejemplos que citamos es el del criollo Luis de Betancourt y Figueroa, también un personaje inquisidor, formaba parte del Tribunal de la Inquisición y tenía una casa pues muy bien amueblada y muy bien decorada, con numerosos objetos suntuarios de Nicaragua, Sevilla, Barcelona, Venecia. Consigna también los cuadros, por ejemplo, el de una mujer vendiendo pescado, las estaciones del año, las artes liberales, 3 lienzos representando a David degollando a Goliat, Judith degollando a Holofernes, la Piedad romana dando de mamar a su padre, así como numerosas pinturas de fruteros. Pero la nota más interesante de este inventario de Luis de Betancourt y Figueroa surge al citar 16 fruteros de mano de Valderrama, de vara de largo y otro poco más de ancho. Este Valderrama sería un pintor local del cual no tenemos especializado en pinturas de frutas, del cual no sabemos más, es la primera noticia que tenemos. Ya para terminar, por ejemplo, tenemos la colección de Juan Antonio de Céspedes y Toledo, caballero de Santiago. Él tenía 18, entre otros lienzos, tenía 18 cuadros de la Fama, pintura de España, 12 cuadros de los 7 infantes de Lara, 14 lienzos de Flandes con la vida de la Virgen, 20 pinturas de fábulas y frutas, 16 navíos, 16 cuadros fruteros, pintura de Sevilla. Otro, por ejemplo, era una niña dormida, y otro de 2 pícaros. En la siguiente podemos ver un ejemplo de ese tema, en la siguiente fotografía, 2 pícaros comiendo uvas y melón, que nos remite precisamente al tema de Murillo, y que hemos constatado que fue un tema muy frecuente en la pintura y en la escultura limeña del siglo XVII. Esto significa que seguramente llegaron también pinturas de Murillo o de sus seguidores y discípulos. También este caballero de la Orden de Santiago tenía en su casa una vista de la ciudad de Sevilla, como podemos ver en la fotografía siguiente. Es un ejemplo que se conserva en el Museo del Prado del siglo XVII y que se ha conservado, hay constancia documental de varios ejemplos en la ciudad de Lima. Por último, hemos dejado el propietario, que tenía una colección de pintura pues muy numerosa, y que parece que tenía un cierto concepto de colección. Se trata de un funcionario de la Real Audiencia, Juan Ochoa Salmerón. Él, a su muerte, se hace inventario de sus bienes y sobre todo se hace inventario de sus pinturas, arrojando nada menos que 347 pinturas en su casa y más de 100 láminas enmarcadas. Realmente es sorprendente. Se encuentran asuntos humanísticos, fábulas, retratos, como por ejemplo cita uno de Santo Toribio de Mogrovejo, como este que estamos mostrando a continuación, la siguiente fotografía, que se encuentra en una colección particular limeña y que sin duda es un anónimo limeño del siglo XVII. Pero lo más interesante es que pasado pocos años debió de haber problemas con la herencia y en 1679 su viuda y su hijo acuerdan realizar la tasación de una selección de las pinturas que estaban en un cuarto aparte y a buen recaudo. Pensamos que serían de mayor calidad y estima. Todas estaban con marcos y tal vez si estaban en una habitación estaban dispuestas a modo de galería de pinturas. Entonces el número se reduce a 96 lienzos y 27 láminas. También en este caso, dado que eran pinturas selectas, se nombra para la tasación a 2 maestros pintores, José de la Parra y a un tal Ignacio de Macinas, que no sabemos de él más que esta noticia, pero es la primera noticia que tenemos de este pintor en Lima. Y hacen, como digo, un recuento de todas las pinturas más valiosas, de la cual hay que citar, y con eso terminaríamos, porque es la única que se cita citando el pintor que la realizó, que es una Virgen de los Ángeles, la siguiente pintura, la siguiente fotografía, una Virgen de los Ángeles de 3 varas de largo y 3 de ancho de medoro, valorada en 100 pesos. Como digo, es la pintura, es mucho dinero y sobre todo, como digo, es la única que he encontrado donde se cita al pintor. Medoro fue un pintor que trabajó en Lima a principios, las primeras décadas del siglo XVII y manifiesta muchos años después el buen recuerdo y aprecio de este pintor italiano que trabajó en la ciudad. Esta imagen que estamos viendo es una Virgen de los Ángeles que se conserva en la Pinacoteca de los Descalzos de Lima hacia 1603, principio del siglo XVII. Como conclusión, Sí parece evidente que lo más abundante en los interiores limeños son claramente las pinturas. Hemos encontrado esculturas, pero muy pocas comparadas con las pinturas. Es decir, hay un gusto especial por lo pictórico. De algún modo, eco de ese triunfo de la pintura, del cual hablaba Jonathan Brown en la España del momento, en el coleccionismo cortesano del siglo XVII, encabezado por el propio rey Felipe IV. Esta tendencia poseía los lienzos por su valor simbólico, así como el reconocimiento de la pintura como arte liberal, y por tanto saber acerca de ella y emitir juicios formaba parte de la cultura de los poseedores, siendo una distinción social en los sectores más cultos. De momento no podemos hablar estrictamente de coleccionismo pictórico todavía, pero sí de gusto artístico y valoración de la plástica, en la cual los temas de paisajes locales, así como las advocaciones marianas locales, virreinales, daban una impronta especial y personal a esta pintura limeña en concreto, a esta pintura americana en general y limeña en particular. Muchas gracias por vuestra atención.
Muchísimas gracias, Rafael. Ha sido fascinante. Luego te preguntaré algunas cosas. Tengo muchas ganas de leer la publicación. Now we will move on to introduce Professor Delia Cosentino. Delia is Professor of History of Art and Architecture, affiliated with Latin American and Latino Studies at DePaul University. Scholar in residence at the Newberry Library, Cosentino studies the visual cultures of Greater Mexico. She is co-author of Resurrecting Tenochtitlan, Imagining the Aztec Capital in Modern Mexico City, and author of Las Joyas de Sinacantepec, Arte Colonial en el Monasterio de San Miguel. She guest edited the volume Cartographic Styles and Discourse for Artlast Bulletin. Thank you so much.
Thank you
Over
so
to
much.
you.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Oh, good. Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you to everybody who's organized this marvelous symposium. I'm delighted to be a part of it, and I appreciate everybody hanging on, knowing that I'm the last talk between you and a drink. And I hope, on behalf of those of us who aren't there in person, you will all take an extra drink for us. I gave a different angle of this paper at the Society for Iberian Global Art Conference, the triennial, this past weekend. If anybody was there in Washington, D.C. for that talk, this it takes a similar subject, but a different angle. So hopefully there's something for everyone here. So this paper concerns the trans-historical and transnational construction of the figure of Tlahuicole, an Otomi warrior who fought to the death while tethered to a sacrificial stone in Aztec Tenochtitlan by command of Emperor Moctezuma II in the years preceding the Spanish invasion of Mexico. Although Tlahuicole is best known through this neoclassical sculpture at the Academy of San Carlos, made at the Academy of San Carlos by Spanish artist Manuel Villar in 1851, the origins of the narrative and related representations follow a complex process of elision and strategic manipulation over the course of hundreds of years. From the 16th century forward, images, texts, and the language around such Aztec figures in combat were curated, merged, and translated by various agents across time and space. I believe that its clearest center comes with the work of Jesuit philosopher Francisco Clavijero and the publication of his wildly popular History of the Aztecs, first published in Italy in 1780. Clavijero's work was informed by a number of early colonial sources, both written texts and some critical drawings by both native and European artists. Clavijero seamlessly consolidated, some might say plagiarized, an enormous amount of information from earlier content creators, and he popularized it. I aim to show that it was the circulation and reproduction of Clavijero's history, and especially one particular image from it, that fostered a powerful legacy in print culture across Europe and beyond, which contributed to a widespread fascination with Aztec gladiators and the ultimate representation of Tlahuicole. I argue that a taste for colorful and exoticized combat imagery, as symbolized by the classical gladiator type, helped to cultivate the crisp visual articulation of Tlahuicole as an appropriate hero for the newly sovereign Mexican state by the mid-19th century. Among the earliest record of a combat scene that would hundreds of years later be identified as a scene of gladiator sacrifice comes in one of the prized manuscripts of native Mexico, the pre-contact Codex Zuxnotl. In the scene in question, we see a standing figure with a raised arm tied by a cord to a circular platform and flanked by two opponents. These are some of the key features of a ritual ceremony typically practiced at an annual festival known among the Aztec as the Feast of the Tlacaxipehualitzli, or the Flaying of Men, in honor of the god of renewal, Xipetotec. The figure on the central platform, the platform itself is known as a temalacatl, or sacrificial stone, was a captive associated with agricultural fecundity, with painted skin and dressed in elaborate regalia, actually meant to signify his impersonation of Xipetotec. The warriors facing him don even more festive costumery, including jaguar masks. Not only is the victim outflanked, but his foes of animalistic ferocity wield weapons and shields, while he has none. Comparable scenes appear in several early colonial manuscripts in which the captive figure faces a single opponent who's now fully dressed as a jaguar, consistent with one League of Warriors in the Aztec state. Accompanying texts confirm that these are representations of festivities during the feast of Tlacaxipehualitzli, for whom the victim is given a weapon, but it is studded with cotton balls, portending his inevitable defeat and subsequent sacrifice to Xipe. A gradual but clear visual translation of these earliest representations of combat sacrifice into Europeanized visions can be seen in manuscripts overseen by mendicant missionaries. In these examples, the culminating event of the Tlacaxipehualitzli ceremonies is rendered as perceptual drama, framed in illustrations. The combat is situated in an articulated landscape with a horizon line. Note, too, that the bound captive is presented with nothing but a loincloth, and he now stands on a squared, elevated platform with steps leading up to the circular stone, and underscoring the heightened position that he occupies before his ultimate fall. In the example from the Dominican Diego Duran's history, the audience includes the Aztec emperor. In the Tovar Codex, an abridged version of the Duran, the scene is distilled into just two figures, their combat at the center of the illusionistic window into a fading Aztec past. Although he was not likely audience to any of these kinds of native representations, the Dutch engraver Theodore de Brie was privy to descriptions of the sensationalized ceremony and rendered a related scene in his compendium of prints of the Americas intended to circulate in Europe. His may be the first illustration of combat sacrifice by a European artist. Given that de Brie never traveled to the American hemisphere, his representation was inspired by textual descriptions like that of José de Acosta, whose own history had been published for a European readership. De Brie, therefore, must imagine his complex array of activities around the Tlacaxipehualitzli feast. On the left, we see the key figure of interest here, a naked captive whose leg is bound now to a large square block. He raises a shield to defend himself against a figure who is fully dressed in a heavy robe and feathered headdress. The adjacent scenes illustrate a continuous narrative featuring the moments before and after combat, with the ultimate fate of the captive featured in the center of the frame. Here, I want to pause for a moment to call your attention to the fact that after my introduction, I have not referred to these illustrations as scenes of gladiators or a gladiator combat, even though in modern scholarship, they are frequently described this way. The word gladiator is derived from the Latin gladius, or sword, so a gladiator, in essence, is a swordsman. It's worth noting that perhaps the single most identifiable feature in especially the native scenes, but in others, is not necessarily the weapon that the captive may or may not possess, but instead it's the stone to which he's bound. In most cases, this temalacatl is pictured as round with a hole in the center. As far as I've been able to determine, this is how all the earliest chroniclers of Mexico identify the ceremony. That is, they report of a ceremony in which the captive is tied to a temalacatl, where he then fights. Something shifts when we get to the early 17th century Franciscan Juan de Torquemada and his Monarquía Indiana, first published in 1615. The text has no illustration, so it's Torquemada's description that interests us here. Torquemada describes the ritual specifically as
We lost it. No, it's on our side.
Wait,
Hello?
1 second. Perfect. Yeah, sorry.
did I just mute or has it been muted?
Sorry, there was someone making noise in the background. I muted you by mistake. Please continue. Sorry.
Okay, I didn't know if I should repeat. Okay, as he describes this ritual specifically as Teatro di Gladiatorio, he ties this Mesoamerican ritual to classical Roman practice. But he also underscores the drama and spectacle of it by invoking a theater, like entertainment at the Colosseum. Torquemada's new linguistic lens through which to see a very particular ritualized act of combat opens the door to the possibility of conceiving of parallel classical practices on both sides of the Atlantic. The invitation is taken up most consequentially in the work of Father Francisco Javier Clavijero, a Creole philosopher who had been expelled from his native Mexico in 1767, fleeing with his fellow Jesuits to Bologna, a vibrant center for educated churchmen. It was there that he wrote the Storia Antica del Mexico as a response to what he saw as European ignorance of native cultures, particularly the Aztec. First published in Italian and then soon after in English and later in Spanish, the history of ancient Mexico enjoyed great popularity and influence. To accompany his description of a variety of cultural practices, Clavijero has an engraving made featured what he explicitly labels Il Sacrificio Gladiatorio, thereby amplifying Torquemada's nomenclature. Here, the full theatrical performance reaches a new level, as the round sacrificial stone becomes a stage-like platform that occupies the bottom half of the engraving. Set against an Albertian-style backdrop with receding buildings, the combat is physically elevated, not simply off the ground, but also by the hulking bodies engaged in the fight, their musculature on the front and back of the torsos, perhaps the defining feature of these figures, now both almost nude. Stripped from the scene is any sense of a relationship between the event and the feast of Xipetotec, which goes unmentioned in the text. Clavijero's written description offers no indication of the original purpose of the combat, an offering for the earth's fecundity during an annual festival. Instead, what he calls the most celebrated sacrifice is defined by the performance of a battle between the prisoner and a Mexican officer, which takes place, he says, quote, before the multitude of people that assembled at such a spectacle. It's worth noting that Clavijero's engraver would have had models for such a representation not only in the Mexican source material, but perhaps even more relevantly, in scores of representations of gladiators circulating in Italy at the time. One notable example is this work by the master of the die, whose prints were a part of an emergent print capitalism, sold for a profit and saturating the market. This print of ancient Roman gladiators would be a logical point of reference for an Italian engraver imagining how to picture Aztecs who engaged in what begins to sound very much like a comparable form of entertainment. Details like the composition of the figures, theatrical setting, as well as the leg guards shown on the figure whose back we see, suggest a strong connection between Clavijeri's copperplate scene of gladiator sacrifice and the Renaissance print. The success of Clavijero's book and overall vision might be measured by its publication history. Following the original Italian publication of 1780, soon translated into English and German and later Spanish, going through numerous editions. Most interesting to me, however, is that of the 20 or so engravings in each of Clavijero's histories, it is one in particular that goes somewhat viral, and that is precisely this image of the gladiator sacrifice. We see it copied, modified, and embellished in various ways to which we turn now. This version, for example, appears in a French publication typical of the venue in which altered versions of Clavijero's print often appear in the first half of the 19th century, universal histories that survey cultures and customs around the world. In this context, the scene of gladiator sacrifice is included most often as a generalized demonstration of customs in Mexico. Here we can see that the image very closely resembles Clavijero's engraving in both caption and composition, but the background has dropped out, and of course the scene is now colorized. A non-colorized version was also published, as was a simplified version of the line engraving here in A Pictorial History of Mexico from 1849. Another fascinating development occurs in the early 18th century in the early 19th century in European print culture and its intersection with Aztec imagery. With Clavijero's books now in wide circulation in multiple languages, his combat print gave way to some fairly faithful models, but with some greatly embellished details, as we see here, for example, in this print from Il Costume Antico y Moderno. In this depiction of Aztec gladiators fighting to the death on the right, we note an elaborate design featured along the vertical edge of the raised platform. It features a repeating pattern of paired figures who are also apparently in combat, like the two men depicted on top of the stone. This is not only an imaginative addition, but instead reveals another stream of new information incoming into Europe from Mexico. Not long after the publication of Clavijero's history, the central plaza of Mexico City was redesigned as part of a larger set of urban reforms. The plaza, or Zócalo, received a neoclassical makeover, including new fencing, fountains, and at its center, the ultimate, though short-lived, placement of an equestrian statue of the Spanish king. As the existing surface was disrupted for repavement, residents witnessed the startling recovery of some of the most sensational Aztec sculptures known to date. This included, perhaps most significantly, the crown jewel of the late imperial Aztec expression, the calendar stone, alongside the frightful Coatlicue stone, who was quickly reburied. The third discovery on the right here was another round stone, but this one with carved details around the horizontal edge. This is the stone of Tizoc, which was understood to be an actual Temalacatl, or sacrificial stone, decorated with reliefs along its surfaces and with a hole in the middle consistent with both visual and textual descriptions of combat sacrifice. After being unearthed, it was propped up vertically against the nearby main cathedral, which is where it remained over a decade later when the Prussian explorer Alexander von Humboldt passed through Mexico. When Humboldt returned to Europe, he prepared his 1810 publication on the mountains, monuments, and people of the Americas, and it included this image, a drawing of a detail from the lateral sides of the Tizoc stone. In the detail, we see the stylized depictions of pairs of figures in apparent combat. One warrior in a large feathered headdress grabs the hair of another warrior who faces him. This scene repeats for a total of 15 times around the circumference of the Temalacatl. This is very clearly what we see in the Italian print from the multi-volume encyclopedia called Il Costume, in which the authors also reprinted Humboldt's drawing of the Tizoc stone, in addition to incorporating its iconography into the colorful image of the gladiator sacrifice. It is just this sort of scene that likely inspired the imaginative reconstruction of an Aztec ceremony in a strange painting by the equally strange French antiquarian Jean-Frédéric Waldeck, in his sensationalized, even gaudy depiction of an enclosed plaza that serves as a stage for a bloody fight on a Temalacatl, replete with designs on its lateral facade. Bloodied bodies are strewn in the foreground as an audience looks on below strangely shaped animal statues and unfamiliar temple forms. Similarly, the print by Welker here in the lower right shows a creative reimagining of a combat scene. In a parallel case of sensationalism around Aztec gladiators in print culture, I wish to turn to one more strange case that serves as more evidence for what I see as somewhat of a frenzy around Aztec gladiators in the 19th century. In a book from 1849 entitled Mexico as It Was and As It Is, the author Franz Meyer printed this image with it. And with it fueled a misguided rumor that hung on for decades. He claimed, based on a friendship with a conservator at the National Museum in Mexico at the time, that there remained buried under the plaza or zocalo a 9-foot in diameter circular stone that had been used for gladiator sacrifices during the festival of Xipe Totec. He also said it was painted in bright colors, but claimed that otherwise the design resembled the illustration that he published and that I'm showing you here. The deception continued with other publications claiming that the sacrificial stone in question was actually much larger than the circular form first published by Meyer, and instead was rectangular and encompassed the original circle, surrounded by 4 additional scenes of warriors. A later colorized version of the same image, the polychrome stone they're calling, still clinging to the notion that it was a gladiatorial stone buried beneath the zocalo. My friends, it was not. The drawing that had sparked rumors was actually an ancient Mexican manuscript long residing in Paris, a copy of which had been made by Father José Antonio Pichardo in late 18th century Europe. This is a case of pictorial telephone where the message gets lost in the circulation over time and space. It also points to a fervent desire for all things gladiator by the 19th century. It is within this broad context that the Spanish artist Villar, who trained in neoclassical sculpture in Rome, arrived in Mexico to help revitalize the Academy of San Carlos, a vestige of the colonial period which had languished in the wake of the War for Independence from Spain. Looking for the perfect theme for a new sculpture that he would give to the school as part of his contract, Manuel Villar says he learned about the story of the general named Tlahuicole from Clavijero, who had written about how the warrior had come from Tlaxcala, an enemy state of the Aztecs, and when he was captured, he had begged to die in the most honorable way, tied to the Temalacatl. But Clavijero hadn't illustrated Tlahuicole, so Villar recognized that he would need to imagine what the Tlaxcalan general might look like, this being the first documented time that the warrior would take representational form. Combining, of course, his knowledge of classical sculptures such as the Laocoon, the Dying Gaul, which was then, by the way, known as the Dying Gladiator, and numerous depictions of Roman gladiators in 3-dimensional sculpture, Villar also took a look at Clavijero's representation of Aztec gladiator sacrifice, and then he designed a plaster cast that would finally materialize the image of the strong, proud man who could be seen as an authentic Mexican hero. Although he claimed that it was an image of his own invention, we can see quite clearly that Tlahuicole though in 3 dimensions, was part of a larger corpus of representations of gladiators which had circulated transnationally in two-dimensional print culture since at least the previous century. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating, Delia. It's incredible how you traced all those links between them. I think now, Nicola, we can open to questions, right?
Yes, please.
Yes. Before to set us off, I was wondering if I could ask Rafael a question. Lo digo en español y luego lo traduzco y luego traduzco lo que me respondas. Entonces, mi pregunta es fascinante todo lo que has sacado de los archivos, me imagino, y sobre todo los inventarios, que son fascinantes del 17 y es un tema que no se ha abarcado. Digamos, el 18 se ha trabajado mucho más, pero el 17 está casi sin tocar. Entonces, a mí me interesaba mucho la figura que decías que podía ser de origen judío, que decías que se llamaba Helder, ¿no?
Helder, sí. Laureano Jacinto Helder, de origen sevillano. Era de origen sevillano.
De origen sevillano.
Pero vamos, de...
Qué interesante.
Era un rico comerciante. Era un comerciante por la numerosa cantidad de productos que había en su casa almacenada, aparte de las pinturas y demás, ¿no?
Qué interesante, sí, ¿no? Porque me interesa también que tuviese las tribus de Israel,
sí,
que es un tema...
14 lienzos de pintura de las tribus con sus bastidores y 12 cuadros de la vida de Adán. La vida de Adán, nunca había visto
la vida de Adán, qué interesante.
Nunca había oído eso.
La vida de Adán. No, yo también tenía curiosidad porque otro recurso interesante del 17 es mirar los procesos de la Inquisición, porque había muchos conversos, bueno, que es criptojudíos, digamos, que estaban ahí en Lima, y porque ahí es justo los procesos de Inquisición, muchos fueron a mediados del 17 y registraron muchas de los inventarios de las personas que procesaron. Entonces me preguntaba si este inventario está relacionado o simplemente por el apellido.
No, este es un inventario que si se publica, pues ahí aparece la referencia documental. No pertenece a la sección de Inquisición.
Vale. Sí,
no
porque
a la sección de Inquisición.
Es más por el apellido que dices que a lo mejor hay ese vínculo judío, ¿no?
Sí, porque sí, a mí me ha llamado lo de Helder, me ha llamado la atención, y como tenía estos cuadros de las tribus, los cuadros de la vida de Adán, era de origen sevillano, un gran mercader. Es un punto de partida, ¿no?
Sí, no, es fascinante. Y del Antiguo Testamento, comparado quizás a testamentos, digamos, en Sevilla, ¿hay más, dirías?
No los conozco los de Sevilla, no los conozco los de Sevilla.
Sí.
No sabría, no he consultado esa bibliografía. Habría que mirar si hay inventarios publicados del 17 y si hay alguna referencia.
Claro, sí, Duncan King queda publicado bastante, y lo que se me sigue asombrando no es lo de los 12 patriarcas, las tribus, esa presencia, entonces...
Y no es el único, no es el único. Hay otros que he citado aquí que también tenían la tribu de Jacob.
Wow. Eso es fascinante, sí. Bueno, ya sabes que es un tema que he trabajado con Zurbarán, así que por eso, si quieres, luego lo hablamos más.
Sí, con lo que tú quieras, yo lo que tú quieras.
Genial. Sí, avísame. Bueno, tengo ganas de leer la publicación cuando salga. Pero sí, muchísimas gracias, Rafael, y luego te escribo para preguntar más cosillas y eso.
Muy bien.
So I was just asking Rafael about the inventory specifically of the one he mentioned of Jacinto Helder, who was, he says, probably a merchant of civilian origin, because he has 12 paintings of the tribes of Israel. And I thought that was quite interesting. And he said that that wasn't the only inventory with paintings of tribes of Israel, which is a very atypical subject matter in Spain and Europe generally, in this period. So I'm quite interested in the topic. And I was just mentioning that during the 17th century, there were a lot of crypto-Jewish communities in certain cities, especially in Lima. There was a big community, so I was wondering if he got the inventory from one of those proceedings of the Inquisition, because they did have quite detailed accounts of their collections. So I look forward to reading his publication in more detail, as it's something close to my thesis. Thank you.
Series of the life of Adam. Strange series.
Yeah, no, that's very unusual. That's why the Old Testament scenes sometimes I remember I haven't studied